A common myth is that Asian Americans are concerned with only their immediate family and clan. They are politically apathetic and they don't get involved in the communities where they live. Today we will meet a couple who will explode that myth and will learn about the wonderful organization they founded, Asian Americans for Community Involvement, AACI, ACI for short. This is Susan Mann of The Better Part. Please stay tuned. Dr. Allan Seid went to UC Berkeley for his undergraduate work, University of Southern California for medical school, and Stanford University for his residency in psychiatry. Mary Chan Seid has a bachelor's degree in sociology from San Francisco State University and did postgraduate work in social work and Chinese studies. Now, in spite of these stellar credentials, they did not pursue traditional professional careers, but became passionate community leaders and advocates for Asian Americans and other minorities. They have an amazing career spanning over 5 decades of service to their community, state, and nation. A warm welcome to The Better Part. May I call you Allan and Mary?
That'll be fine.
Yes. Allan, you have an unusual name for Chinese, S-E-I-D. How do you get that surname?
Well, it's only unusual in the English version. Actually, the surname is an ancient Chinese name that goes back to the founding of the Chinese civilization in the Yellow River Basin. The immigration officer at the San Francisco port must have misheard my great-grandfather and spelled it S-E-I-D.
I see. And Mary, of course, you have a very common Chinese name, one of the most common, Chan.
It's like Smith.
It's like Smith. Now, Allan, you have a wealth of knowledge about Chinese immigration to the United States. Could you give us a brief history? Why did the Chinese come to the United States? When?
Chinese came in 1849. The vast majority came to find gold and to get rich, to send money back to their home village in China. And the villages had members that were in starvation. Approximately 20 years prior to the gold rush, the southern part of China, where most of the early Chinese immigrants originated, were suffering under flood, famine, drought, and most severely from civil wars, where the commoners were attempting to overthrow a brutal monarchy.
Right, so it's very chaotic in China, and this was like the mid-1850s?
Yes, the civil wars actually were occurring about that period of time. Interestingly, the Chinese who first came were welcomed by Americans on our shores as being diligent, industrious, very interested in learning and adjusting.
Right.
And it was only during the mid-1860s when the gold mines began to be depleted.
I see.
And miners were out of jobs. And also in 1869, when the railroads were completed, the laid-off workers were also trying to find jobs. And unfortunately, right at this time in the 1870s, our nation was suffering a countrywide recession. So Chinese were quickly scapegoated at that time, and murders and burnings of entire Chinatowns in many cities across our nation occurred, and it really was a very direct attempt in driving the Chinese back to China.
Right. It's a sad part of our history, right?
Indeed, and this period of heightened racial violence was sanctioned legally in 1882 by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first time in our first and only time in our U.S. history that a immigration law based on race alone was enacted.
Well, it's based on nation too, the nationality, right?
It was specifically based on Chinese.
Right.
It was only later that it was applied to other Asians.
I see.
I would say that this one law, supplemented by a number of lesser laws, effectively barred the Chinese population from developing families for about 80 years.
Wow.
They could not participate in politics nor exercise the basic rights of American citizens. For example, Chinese were prohibited from different employment opportunities, from educational services, from health and human services, community programs, and most devastatingly, they were restricted to ethnic enclaves, which are euphemistically called Chinatowns.
I see. A very devastating effect on the population. Now, Allan, you became a psychiatrist, and that's a rather rare medical specialty for an Asian. What led you to choose that field, and how did that influence your later work in life?
Well, when I was in medical school, my career goal was to become a medical missionary, practicing family medicine. As I got more experience in treating immigrants of different races, and including Chinese, I learned that most of them, while suffering physical illnesses, had significant emotional and mental problems. So
From loneliness, or why?
It was loneliness, certainly, and then loneliness from families at home, isolation in this country, but also the traumas from interacting with the larger community.
I see.
And so I felt it was necessary to become more competent in being a total physician, and that's how I got into psychiatric training. And
I see.
I'm glad that I did. It's something that Mary encouraged me to do, and I think she really steered me in the right course. But it was there after psychiatric training that I became re-involved in community affairs and felt that that was the arena that I would practice. But my heart was always in ending up eventually with a practice in a Chinatown somewhere in the America or a Asian country. So that did not change.
I see. Now, what events trigger you to start AACI? You know, you were both willing to make some pretty big sacrifices in terms of time and money to help the bigger community.
Well, this would be the 1970s, and at that time we both learned and came to realize that the Chinese and many other minorities were encountering serious problems of getting employment, even at that day, and upon employment being barred from promotions. And there were lack of assistance for that would be language appropriate for the immigrant children as well as adults, so that it was very difficult to really be educated, as well as the textbooks at that time was missing from anything about Asia, but we're still, the content and portrayals of Asians and other minority, and women and girls were mostly demeaning. And that became an area of great concern, and there were concerns of ours. In particular, I was concerned with getting language appropriate health services, medical services for immigrants, Chinese and other minorities that needed it. And there was a total absence of that in our entire Santa Clara Valley. Both of us came to a realization that for that type of massive reform to occur, one must have political clout. And we made a survey in 1972 of the 72 commissions available for appointments in Santa Clara Valley and its 12 cities. There were only one Asian American on a commission.
I see.
We knew then that to get services in all those areas, we must develop a core of Asian American politicians and other politicians that will be sensitive to our needs. And that's how we came to decide that our lives would be, in our opinion, meaningful in seeking partners to join us on that journey.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, I was very amused when you told me about the process that you use to find people to help you. Can you talk about that?
Well, we knew that the journey would be difficult and we would be encountering others of different opinion, and even there would be severe barriers by individuals who in the community that did not like change. So we sought help. We sought partners that would be willing to work together collectively on this long journey. There were particular characteristics we were looking for, and some of them were that individuals had to have a compassion and a passion for helping the needy, and there be a demonstrated history in their past that they've actually did so. And it was important to us that they be persons of integrity, that they were ethical, because we knew at that time that with trying to make such changes, we would often be confronted by situations that would cause us to feel depressed and bitter and maybe lash out in unethical manner. So
it seems like a psychiatrist's way of finding people to work with. Now, and then I understand you interview these people for the privilege of working for free with you on a nonprofit, but you recruited a wonderful board.
Well, what we did was to send out, identify lists of persons with reputations of having such characteristics. We asked them if they would be interested in talking to Mary and me, and some of them answered, and we met with them, and a small number did respond affirmatively. Of the ones who seemed great candidates, I have to admit, there were only 3. And with Mary and myself, we had a good group of 5 advocates.
Now, the first 5 years of AACI were those of learning about each other, growth and development. Could you tell us about some of the activities that took place then, Mary?
During the first 5 years, we all had young children.
I see.
And so we decided to form a mothers group. And in that mother group, we discussed way of raising our children. And also because of our children was experiencing many discrimination, name calling, bullying. We discussed how we can deal with that with the schools and the population at large. And then another book, as Allan mentioned, about the textbooks. It was very racist and sexist. So we went to the PDA and got them involved informing textbook reform to free them of the sexist and racist biases.
Right.
Another thing that we did was that we want to build Asian American identity. So we went to the Angel Island and
wonderful.
visit the immigration station.
Right.
And we went to visit fishing station in Monterey,
Where a lot of them
Carmel,
worked. Right.
and China Camp.
Wow. That's
And
wonderful.
we visited Chinese temple throughout California. We
great.
went to gold mine towns, and we visited detention camp, Japanese
Japanese internment camps.
camp.
Wow. That's a great history lesson for them.
Yeah.
Allan, as AACI matured, you focused in on 5 areas. Could you talk about each of these areas? What was the importance of them, and what were you able to accomplish?
The 5 areas included, in no particular important listing, the first was employment. There were widespread complaints and grievances from Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans that they could not get jobs, that they were well qualified by education and
Right.
formal degrees.
Right.
And other common complaints was that after they were hired, they were consistently called on to train new workers, and these new Caucasian trainees would consistently promoted into a higher supervisory position.
Right.
I will cite, and it is a matter of record, that 62 PhD graduates in the field of engineering from UC Berkeley and Stanford as of local universities tried through circulating a well-researched document stating to management that they were not being promoted despite being there over
Right.
10 to 15 years.
Right.
And there was no redress. And that was an example of what AACI took on. And there were other incidents with hospitals with policies that needed to be changed. That was done by what we call our employment committee. And we've talked about education already. There was a
Right.
very active education committee. Mary touched on the starting of it. It was a battle that occurred between 1973 to 1980, a series of 3 battles up in the state capitol, where finally the State Board of Education enacted a code, an educational code, that mandated all publishers who purport to sell books to California public schools that their material be sexist and racist free.
Oh, that's a wonderful win.
And that was a very significant win. The area
Great
of
job.
close to my heart, of course, was in health and human services.
Right.
And there were none. For one example, it took AACI's committee 3 years to convince the county politicians and department heads that Chinese immigrants had severe mental and emotional problems with nowhere to turn.
Right.
And after a 3 years battle to, I guess, eliminate incorrect myths that Asians don't have emotional problems, and to dispel the statistics that the county had that Chinese did not show up for mental health service over the last statistics for the last 10 years. Of course, they didn't show up because the health service did not have language acceptable services. And then
Right.
finally, the area is political appointments. This was critical because what we were lobbying for was representatives on commissions that directly control funds and the distribution of funds for health and
funding.
human services, education, community projects, and similar types of activities. So those were the main activities.
I'm really encouraged that you were able to accomplish so much. Now, later, you were the prime instigator for the purchase of a big facility, a large building called the Moore Park property. Now, why did AACI buy this building? Why was it so important to the AACI goals?
By 1990, AACI had existed for 20 years, and with great fortune, it was able to develop and expand about 20 different programs, from substance abuse to services for women.
So these are direct services now?
Yes, direct services to clients. And it had expanded to such a degree that AACI had to not only have one main headquarters facility, they had to rent and lease 2 additional facilities on the east side of San Jose, plus 9 district offices. I should say 9 offices in 9 different school districts. So we were paying an exorbitant amount of money for leasing, and we needed to bring our services together under one roof. There were critical services that needed to be put together. For example, primary care, where a client would come in and get medical help, and the doctors would discover there's a need for a mental health care.
I see.
So instead of referring them to another organization across town, we wanted services adjacent to one another, where if a medical patient needed a mental health counselor, it would be just next door, and there would be available language capabilities.
Right. So that was one of the advantages of having your own building, right? Now, you must look back at what AACI has become and become very, very proud of what you've done. Now, Mary, what was your proudest achievement in AACI?
My most satisfying program that I developed there was the domestic violence program. And this program has 2 parts. It has the domestic violence outpatient counseling, and it has the woman crisis shelter. The hard part was finding a money to buy a home to build our woman crisis shelter.
Right, because it's not just counseling. You want a place where they can stay and be safe.
Definitely, because when the women were abused in a very terrible way, they were often moved out of the house. They needed not only emotional care, they needed medical care.
I see.
And they need to be away from
a safe place to be.
In a safe place to be.
Right. Now, you both have received numerous awards on a local, state, and national level. In fact, just this year, you received the Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce and Palo Alto Weekly's Tall Trees Award for outstanding citizen volunteers. However, you've always stated that your proudest achievement was the raising of your 3 children. Mary, you once told me an interesting story about raising them in Palo Alto. Could you tell us about that?
Well, when we moved to Palo Alto, we found the school was wonderful. However, the population was only white, upper middle class.
Affluent area.
Affluent, right? Pretty affluent, you know, quite affluent. So we wanted something different. We want our children to experience people of a diverse race and income. This was very important to us.
I see.
And so we try to look for a place that we can provide this experience for them. And then we found a school in Palo Alto that has this diversity. Students that lived there were low-income students. So we transfer our children to that school. And one of the wonderful thing about that school, they provided a program for my children to tutor the population there in reading and math.
Wow.
And when they did that, they really have the ability to know about people who are diverse culture and lifestyle.
Oh, that's great that you would choose that for your children. And how did your children turn out? What did they do?
What lucky, you know. Sometimes raising children you have to be lucky.
Well, I understand your 3 children. One is a doctor, one is a lawyer, and the other's a professor. I think they did pretty well.
Well, my oldest daughter became the medical director for the state of Pennsylvania.
I see.
And she ensures everybody, whoever they are, what income they make, to have good medical care.
Oh, wonderful.
My second daughter, which was do a lot of pro bono work for the Latinos, and she goes to Washington, D.C. to lobby for the Dreamers and to have better immigration law.
Oh, that's wonderful.
My son is a professor of neurobiology, and he helped his university build educational program in Asia and in Central and South America.
Oh, wonderful.
He's able to do that because he spent 5 years in Panama doing research for the Smithsonian Institute, and that's where he learned his Spanish.
It's a wonderful family. Thank you so much for coming, Allan and Mary Seid.
Thank you.
Isn't it uplifting and inspiring to meet Allan and Mary Seid? It's like talking to an Asian version of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta King. They all share the same passion for equality and justice and dedicated their lives to achieving it.
The more we get together, the more we get together.